In this episode, we're going to be talking about the Eucharist. Most Christians consider the Eucharist to be a sacrament, a special means of receiving God's grace instituted by Jesus. It has various names among different Christian churches, including the Eucharist, Holy Communion, the Divine Liturgy, and the Mass. So the central element is when the priest or minister takes the bread and wine and blesses it with the words spoken by Jesus at the Last Supper. Usually all the Christians present will receive the bread and wine in an act called communion, because it unites the people with Christ and with each other. Over the centuries, the way in which the Eucharist is celebrated has changed and has become more elaborate in many circles. The celebration can often include hymns and processions and a rite of penance. Usually they will include prayers as well as readings from and reflections on the Bible. The Last Supper is the origin of the Christian celebration of the Eucharist, which the early church celebrated as the breaking of bread. At the Last Supper, Jesus took bread and wine, blessed them, shared them with his disciples, saying that they should do the same in his memory. The word Eucharist comes from the Greek and means thanksgiving, because the Gospels record that Jesus gave thanks at the Last Supper. Over time, this celebration was particularly associated with the Lord's Day, which is Sunday, the day set aside for Christians to unite in celebration of Jesus' resurrection. Today, some churches only celebrate the Eucharist on a Sunday, but Catholic parishes, for example, celebrate the Mass almost every day. For the Christian churches that celebrate the Eucharist, it has become the principal weekly gathering of the church community. So what is the central part of the Eucharist? That is communion. And which of these are features of the origins of the Eucharist? The word Eucharist comes from the Greek and means thanksgiving. Jesus told his disciples that they should take bread and wine and bless them in his memory. And the Last Supper is the origin of the celebration of the Eucharist. Different churches within Christianity have differing beliefs about the Eucharist and what it resembles, particularly with regard to the real presence and Mass. Due to these different beliefs, not all Christian churches share communion with all fellow Christians. Catholics, for example, do not give communion to Protestants who do not believe in the real presence, as Catholic theology argues that sharing in communion should be a sign of a shared belief. Many Protestant churches believe Jesus intended his followers to share communion as a way of uniting them. Catholics and Orthodox Christians also refer to the Eucharist as the sacrifice of the Mass, believing that the Mass is a renewal of the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. This was also rejected by Protestants, who teach that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was a single saving event that cannot be repeated and does not need to be repeated. Because of these different interpretations, the Eucharist is sometimes celebrated with great reverence and ceremony, and sometimes just as a simple reenactment of the Lord's Supper with minimal ceremony. Some Christians, such as the Quakers, do not perform sacramental ceremonies such as the Eucharist, believing that the sacraments are an inward spiritual experience. In the Catholic Church, there is the belief that the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, the real presence, in a miracle called transubstantiation. The real presence is also accepted by the Orthodox churches, though they do not refer to the miracle as transubstantiation. Protestant churches reject belief in the real presence and believe that the bread and wine represent or symbolize the presence of Christ. So the Catholic Church believes that during the Eucharist, the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ. What's this miracle called? That's transubstantiation. And Catholics and what other kind of Christians refer to the Eucharist as the sacrifice of the Mass? That's Orthodox Christians, as they believe that the Mass is a renewal of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And which of the following is not a name used for the Eucharist? Holy Communion, Confirmation, the Mass, or the Divine Liturgy? That's confirmation that's not used. And what are some of the different Christian beliefs about the Eucharist? We know that Catholics and Orthodox Christians believe in the real presence, that Quakers do not perform sacramental ceremonies such as the Eucharist, and that Catholics and Orthodox Christians refer to the Eucharist as the sacrifice of the Mass. That's all you need to know about the Eucharist.